Welcome to the 2025 Affordable Housing Program Compliance webinar. My name is Kelly Chu. I'm on the AHP compliance team, and I reviewed the initial monitoring request. I will be presenting today with my colleague, Sharon, and I'm going to let her introduce herself.
Hello, my name is Sharon Dawkins. I'm a part of the compliance team, and I conduct the long-term monitoring reviews.
Thank you, Sharon. Okay, so today we're going to discuss what to expect after the announcement of your AHP award and how to plan for a successful compliance requirements in all stages of the process, including disbursement, initial monitoring, and if applicable, long-term monitoring. So first, we will outline compliance requirements and their timelines. And next, we're going to discuss compliance best practices, the financial workbook, validating scoring. And we will go into detail about modifications, cures, benchmark deviations, and non-compliance. And finally, for those that this is applicable, we will go into details about our HIQW form in long-term monitoring. A quick reminder, in order to receive credit for the webinar attendance, you must stay for the majority of the presentation, as mentioned in our webinar invitations. And if you have questions throughout the presentation or about your project or any general questions, feel free to contact us by phone, and our contact information is listed at the end of this presentation. So before we start, we want to talk about what the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco is. We are a government-sponsored enterprise, which means while we are a private entity, we only exist because of a congressional statute. We are a cooperative made up of member financial institutions. Our mission is to enable families and individuals of all income levels to obtain quality housing and become homeowners by providing low-cost funding and other services to members, and providing community investment programs to fund affordable housing and community and economic development. So we can be different than other affordable housing gap financing. We are regulated by the Federal Housing Finance Authority, FHFA, which sets nationwide guidelines on how AHP operates. And we are audited annually on our compliance to the guidelines. AHP-funded projects must demonstrate feasibility at application, at disbursement, and at initial monitoring. Projects must demonstrate a need for subsidy at application, at disbursement, and at initial monitoring. If the project changes and needs a modification, the project must have good cause, an attempt to cure, and must demonstrate why it cannot meet previous commitments. So we are assuming that you are attending this webinar because you have received an AHP award. Congratulations. And we want to give a brief outline of the various compliance and reporting steps before we go deeper into the weeds of how to meet those steps. So after the announcement of an AHP award, a project has 4 years to complete construction and request a disbursement for funds. The bank tracks construction progress by asking sponsors and members to complete an online semi-annual survey twice a year until the project is deemed to be complete, which is defined as having been approved for habitability and having the AHP subsidy fully disbursed. As soon as the project is deemed to be complete, it kicks off the 15-year retention period. As it gets closer to the 4-year deadline for all project completion, we will follow up on the semi-annual status report for more information on the project. If there is a change in staff, please notify the bank so that we can update our records with the most current contact person's information. So once the building is considered habitable, you will have 2 years to complete initial monitoring review. If your project is not financed with low-income housing tax credits, it will likely go through long-term monitoring review every 3 years after the initial monitoring process. And finally, there is a 15-year retention period from the date of the project's completion, during which the project must remain compliant until the end of the period. If there are or may be any significant changes in the project's characteristics, please notify the bank so that we may modify the project profile and rescore it to ensure that it remains eligible for the AHP subsidy. The project must have good cause for any modifications and must demonstrate why it cannot meet previous commitments. So a project can request funds when it has full site control. All funds are secured, and construction or rehabilitation is imminent, underway, or once construction is complete. When you are ready to request disbursement of the AHP subsidy, visit our website to review the disbursement request instructions and complete the required forms. Similar to application, documents can only be accepted electronically. Therefore, before submitting the completed forms, a workspace must be requested and set up through our online portal. We will cover electronic document submission later in the presentation. So once the forms are submitted, be sure to email the bank and let us know that the disbursement package is ready for review. The disbursement request document will list all the required forms, including the workspace request form, to set up a secure portal for disbursement. And we aim to review your disbursement within the 45 days, but this process depends on the complexity of the disbursement and the responsiveness of the sponsor and member to additional questions. So to process your disbursement request, the bank will review the project's financing and scoring commitments, project readiness, and the sponsor's ability to complete construction within a 4-year timeline. And additionally, the project must continue to demonstrate its need for subsidy and financial feasibility. In order to validate the project's feasibility and need for subsidy, we will review the project's updated Excel workbook, which includes current rent roll, development budget, operating pro formas, AHP benchmarks, and any other documentation that is available and relevant to validate the project's scoring commitments. We will go into greater depth on the workbook and documentation to validate scoring later in our presentation. And also, instead of waiting until the initial monitoring review, if the project is complete, final documents or evidence of scoring commitment that are ready and available at disbursement should also be submitted. In terms of how you will receive the AHP subsidy, the bank will wire the AHP subsidy to the member bank, and after the member bank receives the subsidy, the member bank will disperse the fund to the project sponsor's account. AHP funds disbursed to the member must be delivered to the project owner within 30 days of the bank's funding date. So with the current interest rates, we advise the importance of meeting the 30-day grace period to avoid interest repayment to the bank. And this would be especially relevant for a large subsidy. And now I will pass it over to Sharon.
Thanks, Kelly. So the next step in the compliance process is initial monitoring. AHP regulations require the bank to monitor all projects. By signing the direct subsidy agreement, members and sponsors agree to the bank's monitoring requirements. When the project is deemed complete, meaning all AHP subsidy is fully disbursed and the project is habitable, we will contact the project sponsor and member to start the initial monitoring review. This usually happens within 12 months of project's completion. At that time, we will request documentation that was not collected at disbursement. The bank will notify the project sponsor and member by email requesting specific documentation. This slide shown here is the AHP Initial Monitoring Documentation Checklist created per sponsor's request. It's designed to help sponsors and members plan and collect appropriate documentation for the review. The document shown here will be emailed as an attachment with our initial email request. The bank requires an annual certification for all non-tax credit projects during the 15-year retention period. The sponsor contact will receive an email with a link to the one-page online certification to be completed. The process allows the project owner to certify that the project's AHP units remain affordable, the tenant's income targeting requirements are met, and that there are no feasibility issues with the project. Once the certification is submitted, the bank will send a confirmation receipt. If the project cannot be certified due to feasibility issues, please contact us for next steps. Projects without tax credits are monitored every 3 years during the retention period. The same income guidelines that are used for initial monitoring are also used for long-term monitoring. For monitoring, we need to confirm that the project is meeting targeting and affordability requirements per the application. Unlike disbursement and IM, we do not ask for the project's financials. During the long-term monitoring, projects must complete an Excel financial workbook showing the rent roll. We will select a tenant sample and ask for documentation that validates tenant's income at move-in, the household size, and documentation that validates tenant's current rent. We will also request a signed tenant income certification or the bank's HIQW form signed, which we will review later in this presentation. Projects that are 100% emergency shelters and most residential medical facilities do not require income and rent documentation. If the project has transitional units, those units must be identified as they will be monitored. Now we'll go over how to be successful during the compliance process for disbursement, initial monitoring, and long-term monitoring. And later we'll go into more detail about required documentation, our Excel final workbook, and more. So preparation and best practices. Because there is a considerable amount of time between application, submission, and project completion, we recommend creating an AHP file to prepare for disbursement and initial monitoring. The file should contain all AHP documents from construction inception to project completion, including the lease-up phase. Also, you want to keep track of AHP procedures and policies. These are codified in our annual AHP implementation plan. In addition, the bank sends out special attention bulletins and notices when significant changes occur in the program. And you can find these notices posted on our website under Community Programs, AHP section, under Policy Updates. Electronic documentation submission. Like an application, the bank will only accept documents electronically through a secure online portal hosted by BlackBerry Workspace. Documents submitted via Dropbox or other file sharing links will not be accepted for security purposes. Prior to accessing the secure portal, an executed workspace setup request form must be provided by the member and sponsor for each project. This is a separate portal from your application. And we'll go through this process again for disbursement. This workspace will be used for disbursement, initial, and long-term monitoring if applicable. We will resend the workspace invite each time. You can visit our website to review the submission instructions and to download the workspace setup request form. Please send us an email when all documents have been uploaded to the appropriate folders. Also, make sure you redact all personal identifiable information that is not necessary for our review, such as Social Security numbers, ID numbers, and any health diagnoses. Now, this slide provides a list of documents that will be requested during disbursement and/or initial monitoring. We highly recommend communicating the program requirements and application commitments to your asset manager, property manager, compliance staff, and those involved with empowerment services and income qualification. For tax credit and 100% shelter projects, we only ask for tenant samples if too many fail notifications are shown on the rent roll in the financial workbook. Please make sure all documents you provide are signed by all parties and match the data you have entered into your financial workbook. Now I'll pass it back to Kelly to go over the workbook.
Thank you, Sharon. Okay, so now we're going to go over the financial workbook. So this document is required at both disbursement and at initial monitoring. A simplified version of the rent roll tab is also required during long-term monitoring. So during this presentation, we are only sharing excerpts from the general fund workbook, but please note that we have a separate financial workbook for Nevada targeted funds projects, which can be found on our website. All projects are required to complete a financial workbook. This Excel workbook has 9 worksheet tabs. So starting with tab 1 is the workbook instructions as shown here on the slide. We highly recommend that you review this tab before completing the workbook to reduce errors. So for example, one of the more common errors we see in the workbook is forgetting to enter the scheduled rent for vacant units or excluding utilities to the rent. Also, be sure to use the latest version of the workbook. The date and version number are shown on the top right corner of every tab. We updated this workbook in the beginning of the year, so you can see the sample shown here is the most current version. It's dated January 1st, 2025, and please do not use an older version from disbursement or application, as we will have to return it back to you to update the workbook with the most current version. And a link to the current workbook is also included in the initial email that you will receive. You may also find all updated AHP documents for initial monitoring and disbursement on our website under Resources. So this slide here is the second tab, which is the rent roll. And when completing the rent roll, please include all occupied, vacant, market rate, and employee units. For projects that are not yet occupied at disbursement, you can type in vacant in the column titled Tenant Rent and fill in the estimated information for each unit, including the scheduled rent. The white cells are for data entry, and the green cells are blocked for auto calculation. When entering the 50% HUD area median income limit, be sure you enter the income limits that are published as of the rent roll date. We will review the rent roll to ensure that the project is meeting its targeting and affordability commitments. So make sure to choose the drop-down menu for the project-based subsidy question in the top right corner. of the worksheet. And next to the tenant name, select emergency shelter, homeless, and the special needs column if this is applicable to your project. And please ensure that these are correct as they may be, we may select a sample for these. In this example, you will see failed messages due to this household income is less than rent. And also the rent charged to the household exceeds 30% of the target income. So if this happens, to avoid a delay in the monitoring process, it is important to resolve all failed messages before submitting the final workbook, or submit an explanation and supporting documentation along with the workbook. So before we get into other tabs of the workbook, we want to talk a little bit more about the bank's guidelines for determining the project's need for subsidy and financial feasibility at disbursement and at project complete. We analyze the development budget and performance with a holistic approach to ensure that the project's costs are reasonable and that the project is feasible at disbursement and at initial monitoring. And we will cover this topic in greater details in the next few slides. The disbursement and initial workbook, initial monitoring workbook includes a development budget and pro forma. This workbook is similar to the application workbook. We compare the original budget from application or disbursement to final actual costs at project completion. So make sure you provide explanations for any line items that shows significant variances. The project's total uses must equal to total sources. The financing gap must also equal to the AHP subsidy. The operating pro forma must show positive net cash flow throughout the 15-year retention period. The total developer fee must be no more than 15% after removing reserves and developer fees from total cost. Any developer fee overs that is not offset by an owner equity contribution will need to be repaid to the bank. And for all HP benchmarks, make sure any deviation are explained and validated with backup documentations. So now let's go over these worksheets. So here is the AHP development budget or uses of funds. So make sure at application column figure matches what was submitted at application, at disbursement, or subsequent modification approved by the bank. Using the drop-down menu, you can change the at application tab to at disbursement when you're submitting this workbook for initial monitoring review, and you can select project complete. So the uses of funds worksheet compares the budget from application or disbursement to the final actual cost at project complete. Explain any significant changes on the right-hand side of the worksheet using the comments column. You can provide explanations that help us understand the changes and do not use explanations such as per final bid. And make sure to select the building type and whether the development is a rehab, as these two fields ties to the benchmark tab, and also provide a description for all line items that are listed as other. When you are completing this worksheet, we recommend using the project's final audited financial statement or tax credit cost certification. The bank requires the submission of the project's final cost certification to validate total development costs. For sources of funds, we require third-party source documentation, so which takes us to the next slide. So this is the source of funds worksheet. We have the same drop-down menus as the uses of funds worksheet. All sources of funds must be validated by third-party documentation, such as promissory notes, grant agreements, or other lender documentation validating the funding amount and source. If funding changes between application, disbursement, and project complete. Please submit documentation supporting the final funding amount that are reflected on the workbook in the final cost cert. So this includes construction to permanent loans. Please provide documentation validating the loan amount, interest rate, loan term, and amortization. If your funder requires excess proceeds repayment that lower the overall balance of the loan, make sure that the repayment language is in your loan agreement. If the worksheet is completed correctly, you will see that the gap financing amount will be the same as the AHP subsidy amount. The lower section is where you will enter the terms for hard debt, and this will auto-populate loan payments. So let's take a look at the pro forma. So here is the year one operating pro forma worksheet. For application column, income and expense reported here should match your application workbook. Use the drop-down menu and select at disbursement when you are completing this workbook for initial monitoring review, and select project complete. So same as uses in sources worksheet, provide a brief explanation for any significant changes in the comments column. So as for 2025, we no longer evaluate the project's DSCR and cash flow benchmarks. Services can now also be above the line without third-party validation. However, we still look at the overall operational feasibility of the project. If cash flow is negative for any year in your 15-year pro forma, the project must show that there is sufficient capitalized and impounded operating reserve to cover the deficit. So for the 15-year operating pro forma, most of the data is auto-populated, but some of you have to carry over for all 15 years. Enter operating subsidies and reserve if those are applicable to your project. Make sure to reflect any residual receipt payments for 15 years. And review the project's net cash flow, as it should be positive during the 15-year retention period, or you will need to explain how the project will cover any deficits. So if your project has commercial space, make sure you complete the commercial pro forma tab. Depending on your selection, this will auto-populate into the 15-year pro forma. So the top right corner here has a drop-down menu to select the type of lease. So if it's a triple net lease, meaning all expenses are paid by the tenant. So we will ask for a lease agreement to validate the commercial rent and expenses shown on the pro forma. Okay, so now we will move on to benchmark deviations. After completing the previous worksheets, check the AHP benchmark tab to see if there are benchmark deviations. You can see them highlighted in yellow with a note. So the Nevada Targeted Fund Workbook has slightly different benchmark limits that are more relevant to Nevada projects. So at initial monitoring, the construction cost per square foot benchmark will need to be checked manually by comparing the RS means benchmark for the area based on the project's habitability date. Otherwise, the benchmark will calculate automatically based on current numbers. All deviations require a reasonable written explanation. Some of them will require third-party documentation for the deviation. The operating cost per unit per year benchmark is bifurcated. Projects in the SF Bay Area and LA Metro area has a lower limit of $5,000 per unit and an upper limit of $10,000. All other general fund projects must be within the $4,000 to $8,000 range. And the 2025 Nevada Targeted Fund Workbook shows a range of $4,000 to $6,000. So this benchmark will auto-populate based on the project's location that you enter in the Rent Roll tab. Operating costs exceeding the area benchmark will require a detailed explanation of the project's unique expenses or population that supports the cost above the benchmark, or comparable operating budgets from projects with a similar population, location, and/or other operating needs. If capitalized operating reserves or annual replacement reserves are over the benchmark, third-party documentation must be provided to validate all required reserves. A written explanation of the justification for the higher capitalized reserve amount should also be included in the workbook. Okay, so now I will pass it back to Sharon.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on and talk about retention documents. All projects must have a legally enforceable retention mechanism to secure the AHP subsidy for 15 years from project completion. Template documents are available on the bank's website under AHP Disbursement Rental. When using the templates, please use both the promissory note and rider to the deed of trust. If the member does not use the bank's template, or if the template is altered, an opinion letter from the member's attorney is required. If the project is a HUD 202 or 811 project, a HUD rider to the AHP deed of trust is also required. For detailed information, please visit the bank's website under AHP Disbursement Rental. If the project is a 221D4 or 223F, please note that the HUD subordination agreement and HUD rider to restrictive covenants, as approved by HUD, will need to be included. Both documents are available on the bank's website. We noticed a few members or sponsors adding interest to the AHP subsidy as a loan to the project. Please note, if any interest is added, this must be paid back to the bank. We also have specific retention documents for use on tribal land to go along with our 5-point scoring category for Native housing, which was added in the 2022 application round. These documents do not need to be recorded, as they will still meet AHP regulation requirements for a legally enforceable retention mechanism. Template documents are available on the bank's AHP website under AHP Disbursement Rental. Specific areas of the document can be edited to address different tribal needs. However, if the member does not use the bank's template, or the template is altered in ways that are not allowed, again, an opinion letter from the member's attorney is required. Now let's move on to validating scoring. Projects are responsible for meeting the same criteria they receive points for at application. The bank requires third-party documentation to validate the project's various scoring categories, such as targeting, nonprofit sponsorship, empowerment, homeless housing, special need units for seniors, households requiring large units, and community stability. Many of these were validated at application, but items that may have been changed or can only be validated during the building, after the building is completed, will be reviewed. For example, if the project received credit for special needs senior unit, we will select a sample of seniors and request their IDs or ticks to validate that the senior meets the 55 or older age requirement as a part of the special needs score requirement. Please note, we do not validate other special needs categories as these are more confidential in nature. The project scoring commitments are outlined in the project evaluation form attached to the direct subsidy agreement as Exhibit A. If there are any changes to these project characteristics, the project sponsor must notify the bank to ensure that there are no adverse effects on the overall project score, which would render the project ineligible for subsidy and/or repayment. When preparing documentation for empowerment services and community stability, refer to the bank's website for a list of acceptable forms of verification. Empowerment services must be of a regular, ongoing nature and free of charge. Except for daycare, services must be offered on site and be available to all AHP residents. For financial literacy education, services must be provided at least twice a year through the 2020 round. For projects awarded in 2021 and onward, financial literacy will fall under the training and education category, and frequency will be bi-monthly or 6 times a year. In addition to the in-person services, empowerment services may now include digital services with a live person, such as a phone call with a service coordinator, Zoom meetings, and/or digital learning programs with a live person. Take note that the digital services must also provide documentation or validation that they took place. For community stability, sustainable development commitments, note that AIRS improvement only applies to rehab projects. Documentation submitted to validate homeless housing must be third party and clearly state the nature of homelessness, such as living in a shelter, living in a pre-institution temporary dwelling, or living in a space not designed for sleeping accommodations. Documentation that notes the type of subsidy eligibility but not the nature of homelessness must align with the bank's definition. For example, VASH eligibility requires homelessness that meet the bank's definition, but oftentimes continuum of care eligibility does not meet the bank's definition as they use a broader at-risk definition. Please note that language such as lacking a fixed, regular, or adequate residence is vague and will require additional information to meet the AHP homeless definition. The bank accepts certification forms from temporary housing agencies. However, for shelters or transitional housing, tenants must be allowed to stay in an AHP unit for at least 6 months and be able to keep their personal items on site daily to qualify for AHP homeless credit. Self-certification forms will not be accepted for homeless verification. Points will not be awarded for at risk of homelessness unless individual or family will reside in a tribal project that is awarded points under native housing. I'll pass it back to Kelly.
Great. Thank you, Sharon. Okay, so as stated previously, if there are significant changes or the possibility of changes in the project's characteristics, please notify the bank so that we may modify the project profile and rescore the project to ensure it remains eligible for AHP subsidy. This includes changes in ownership or in targeting and affordability during the 15-year retention period. For all modification, Cure First is part of our FHFA regulation. The bank will first request that the project sponsor or owner make a reasonable effort to cure any modification needs within a reasonable period of time, or provide an explanation of why the cure is not possible. For example, if a project received a certified green point rating but committed to silver, the sponsor would need to go through the process of attempting to get the silver rating before attempting to modify. So this is the same for homeless points. Let's go back. So if the project fails to meet the bank's definition, the project may need to move in individuals who meet our homeless definition as the project's units become vacant. So if a cure is not possible or cannot be done in a reasonable period of time, the project can modify. If we use our previous example, so let's say that the cost to a silver rating versus a certified green point rating include an additional $1 million in building upgrades, and that budget is no longer available due to construction escalation, then the project cannot cure. Or if the project is going to take 2 years to move in 10 additional homeless units, meeting the bank's definition, that is not a reasonable period of time. So both of these projects can modify if they have additional points. And please note, modification cannot reduce the project score below the lowest score of the awarded projects. This would require a repayment in the AHP subsidy. Okay, so let's move on to non-compliance. So some of the most common causes of project non-compliance are when a sponsor does not respond to the bank's initial monitoring request or is slow to respond. As a result, the lack of documentation to support the project's need for subsidy in scoring categories, including income documentation, may cause the project to be non-compliant. While it seems that like a long time, projects do become non-compliant because they fail to meet the 2-year deadline. On average, our initial monitoring review takes approximately 2 to 3 months before a project is closed. Another common cause is changes in the scoring categories that reduce the project score below the round's lowest score. The project would be disqualified from the round, which would require full recapture of the subsidy. And other causes are developer fee exceeds 15% of the net development cost, a modification that was not communicated to or approved by the bank prior to initial monitoring, or the project hasn't demonstrated a need for subsidy, which may be due to sources being greater than uses caused by cost savings or an increase in tax credit equity or other sources. So any of these issues can trigger a partial or full recapture of the AHP subsidy. So therefore, it is imperative to communicate with bank staff any significant changes in the project and provide a cure plan and good cause explanation so that we can assist you to ensure that your project remains eligible for subsidy. And we strongly recommend using the AHP retention templates, and they are available on our website, and they will help to ensure compliance with our AHP regulations. Okay, so now back to Sharon to go over long-term monitoring.
Thanks, Kelly. Now we'll move on to long-term monitoring. Projects without tax credits are monitored every 3 years during the 15-year retention period. Not all projects may be selected for long-term monitoring. Selection is based on a variety of factors. Projects that are 100% emergency shelters and most medical residential facilities like substance abuse treatment centers are not subject to long-term monitoring. However, if the project has transitional units, long-term monitoring will be conducted for those units. For long-term monitoring, we will send an email with a workbook link and instructions. You can also find the workbook on our website. The workbook has 3 tab worksheets: instructions, the rent roll, and the rent roll summary. You will be asked to complete the financial workbook. Please review the instructions and complete the document. Here is an example of the long-term monitoring workbook. It looks a lot like the IM workbook, but has a column that identifies emergency shelters. Once we have received the completed workbook, we'll select a tenant sample from the rent roll, as well as ask any explanations for all fails. It's important this workbook is accurate before you submit it, as many sponsors notice their typos once we ask for fail explanations or tenant sample validation. For the tenant sample, we ask the sponsor to provide tenant initial income documentation at move-in. This will include the bank's AHP household qualification worksheet or state tenant income certification, or the HUD 50059. We also require third-party income and asset verification and documentation validating all household members, such as IDs or leases. The AHP HIQW tab that we'll discuss next outlines all ID and income verification documentation that can be provided. Please make sure you are collecting this income documentation before submitting the workbook. This should be part of your intake process. For tenants 18 years old and over that do not earn income, the bank requires a zero income certification or a self-affidavit. To ensure the rent is affordable, we also require copies of the lease or documentation showing the current rent amount as shown on the rent roll. It's important to make sure rent disclosed on the rent roll matches the documentation provided. Once the long-term monitoring has been completed, you will receive an email notifying you of the completion. Let's see. We use the HIQW for projects that do not use a state tenant income certification, also known as the TIC, or the HUD 50059. This form is required to be signed by the tenant and property management. Let's take a look at the workbook to go over the AHP income guidelines. Take note, we've recently updated the workbook as of September 2024. Please make sure you are using the most current document. You can find the version in the top right corner of the page. So there are 4 tabs to this workbook as shown at the bottom of this slide. Tab 1, Guidelines. Tab 2, Acceptable Verification. Tab 3, Instructions, and Tab 4, Household Income Qualification. The second tab outlines acceptable forms of income, assets, and ID verifications for each household member. If you're not sure what to provide, check this tab. If your project is transitional housing, tenants may not come to the project with all needed documentation, or it may not be available, please let your analyst know if documentation was not able to be collected and why. The third tab is step-by-step instructions on how to complete the bank's AHP income qualification worksheet. The fourth tab is the AHP Household Income Qualification Worksheet. It serves as an income certification form. Because it's an Excel worksheet, it also calculates and shows the math on how the household's income is calculated. The shaded cells are protected. For Section 1, enter the qualification date, MSA region, and 100% AMI for the household as of the year of move-in. Section 2, list all household members currently living at the same address. We require documentation to validate all household members. Section 3, this is where all income earning assets are to be listed. Per our updated asset requirements, households with less than $50,000 in assets are not required to report. So make sure to check the small box in the corner of this section and provide documentation certifying household asset balance is below the $50,000 threshold. Before moving into Section 4, make sure that you use at least 2 calculation methods, if possible, and choose the highest income projection. If minimal income guidelines apply, be sure to check the small box on the far right. This applies to projects like transitional housing, where individuals may be coming to the project with minimal documentation. This slide covers Section 4 and provides examples of how income is calculated for each household member. So for household member number 1, employment income is estimated by using the hourly rate calculation based on information provided by the verification of income. Household member number 2, employment income shows annualized income based on pay stubs provided. This yields a higher income projection than using average pay per period calculation. A reminder that the first pay stub of the year is required to validate the start date. Household member number 3 is not required to be reflected in this section, as the household member is under 18 years old at the time of move-in, and no income documentation is required. Household member number 4 is reporting 0 income. A 0 income affidavit or certificate is required. At the bottom of the worksheet, there are 2 signature lines. Both the tenant and sponsor signatures are required once the total income is determined. I'll pass it back to Kelly.
Okay, thank you, Sharon. Okay, so here's our so if you have specific compliance or disbursement questions pertaining to your projects or any general questions, so feel free to contact us by phone. So here is all of our contact information. If you are unsure who to contact, you can email the general AHP email, and it will be forwarded to the appropriate staff member, team member based on topic. And if you're interested in learning more about our other community investment programs or products, you can visit our website to find out when our other workshops and webinars are scheduled. Okay, so this concludes our presentation. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and we really appreciate you taking the time to attend this webinar.